My name's Steve Janicki. I'm a consultant in Waterways management, particularly focused on the south coast of Western Australia where I live. And I'll be talking about various features of our rivers that make them unique in some way. Even though rivers have much in common across the world, we have a unique environment.
And my name's Geraldine Janicki. I work as an aquatic ecologist, and Steve and I work together as husband and wife and environmental consultants.
The areas that we're looking at, circled in red, is the Esperance Sandplain. We find here the Young River and Lort River, which flow into Stokes Inlet, and also looking at erosion on the Dalliup River. The purple circled area is the Fitzgerald River National Park, and we're looking at some of the features of the Hamersley River and also the Fitzgerald River. The yellow area is the environment of the Bremer River, which flows from inland down to Bremer Bay, finishing in Wellstead Estuary. The blue circled area contains the Pallinup River, which is one of the larger catchments on the south coast and also one of the most highly modified and degraded in many ways compared with rivers, for instance, in the Fitzgerald River National Park. The photos that we'll be looking at there of the nature of the river are in the middle reaches. The green circled area, which has the Stirling Range in the middle, some of the images there are wetlands north of Ongerup, which are parts of old paleo channels of rivers that once extended inland, and some of the wetlands that you find in the Albany hinterland areas, showing a variety of conditions from freshwater through to hypersaline systems, and some of them are almost brine. The photo we're looking at the moment is of the Hamersley River, which flows through the Fitzgerald River National Park and is one of the most pristine catchments on the south coast.
It sits mostly within the park with just a few sections of the upper reaches in the agricultural zone.
Yeah, so we can get an idea from the Hamersley of what conditions were like for some of the other rivers that are more degraded along the south coast, although this is a fairly relatively arid area. And here we can see the river has cut down into the granite basement, which is a feature of most of the rivers of the south coast. So granite, grey and orange subdued colours is a characteristic of the landscape.
It's also at the point where it's starting to cut down onto the Ravensthorpe ramp, or this is part of the Ravensthorpe ramp where the slope of the land goes down from the Yilgarn Plateau down to the coast.
Yeah, it's called a fairly average-looking photo, but this illustrates a few points about the underlying geology on the south coast. We have here exposed granite, and above that is that whitish rock there is weathered granite with lots of quartzite. The feldspars have broken down. It's what's called saprolite, and on top of that is a conglomerate sedimentary layer, which is often referred to as the Werrilup Formation, and that is the remnant of more ancient river flows. So it's a fairly common feature we find along the south coast, but it's not often that you get to see these interfaces because they're often obscured by rubble and scree slopes, so that's why I took the photo there.
That site also is interesting because it was the water just down the bottom below there was quite highly saline, and this is right in the middle of the Fitzgerald River National Park. Yeah. So the saline water came from the groundwater of the Werrilup, which was already saline.
Yeah, probably 1.5 times as salty as the sea, which was interesting.
It illustrates that salinity is a natural part of the landscape.
along the coast, and particularly in the Fitzgerald River National Park, there's a layer of rock overlying the granite and the Werrellup formations in places, and it's called spongylite. It's actually a very fine clay material, marine material, sediment, with a high composition of sponges, and that material, as far as I gather, was deposited when the sea level was a lot higher, and so this is ancient marine sediments in a maybe 80, 100 metres thick. The mesa in the foreground is called Rose Rock, and the explorer Rowe mentioned that in his travels.
And the river in front of that is called the Fitzgerald River,
yeah,
which the park's named after.
Yeah. So, but spongylite it goes inland to varying degrees towards the east, as far inland as Campbelder on the goldfields, but along the south coast it's much more coastal, so you're looking at 30, 40 kilometres at most. There is a little patch in the Stirling Ranges. So that's an ancient seabed being eroded by the rivers.
So the mesa has been left behind, but the Fitzgerald River and the Twirtup Creek and a few of the other creeks that are there have been slowly eroding that landscape down.
And they've cut down into the underlying granite in many places. Here's a close-up down in the Fitzgerald River Valley, and you can see the spongylite cliffs, very colourful, whites, oranges, and dominating over the greys of the granite. And in some areas we've found other types of rock, shales that have been squeezed into interesting patterns, and they can vary from bright red through to greens and blues. So it's very picturesque down through some of those areas.
And the vegetation there is your mallee, Esperance sandplain type mallee vegetation.
Yeah, and that was common even in the Albany hinterland, where we get more open woodland forest type trees. There's that sort of transitional zone in the Albany hinterland area between the east and the west. This is a bit closer to Albany, but still a bit east. This is the Bremer River, flows into Wellstead Estuary at Bremer Bay, and it's one of the longest river pools on the south coast. Generally, average river pool length, I've found, looking at aerial photos, is about 350 metres, and maybe 20 to 25 metres wide. But every now and again you get those that are longer, and a kilometre is not all that frequent, but they do occur, and in some cases you may get a distinct river pool that's 2 metres long. Generally they're still quite shallow, as the next slide shows. And here's a low water level in the same pool. You can see there's quite a bit of sediment. There's a cleared agricultural areas in the upper catchment. However, the river corridor for the lower half is actually quite well protected with native vegetation. So it begs the question, is that level of sedimentation natural, or has it been aggravated by clearing up further upstream?
Certainly the fluctuations in water level is a natural feature of the rivers, where they will fill up not just by your winter rainfall, but more by your summer storms that would come in and dump huge amounts of floods into the river, and they'll fill up all the river pools. And then over the succeeding years, the river pools slowly go down until there's the next major flood or larger flow event through a summer storm. Yeah. The aquatic fauna is used to this style of flows, and well adapted to living without having desiccation resistant forms of either in the eggs or juveniles.
Okay, slide 6 was Delliup, Del 014, was Delliup River back in 2000, early 2000, a massive flood or storm event occurred over the Delliup River, which is just west of Esperance, and the catchment had been cleared largely in the 60s, was highly cleared for agriculture, and in that short period of time to 2000, it hadn't experienced a major cyclonic rainfall event, but it was only a matter of time, and the flood was huge. It came down the catchment and took out huge chunks of the banks of the river. 93 road crossings went out, including the South Coast Highway bridge, and people were quite shocked at the scale. They hadn't seen anything like that before. But because of the clearing right down to the water's edge of the old narrow channel, they had inadvertently weakened the banks, and so in places the channel went from perhaps 20 metres wide to 200 metres wide, and a huge amount of sediment headed downstream into some wetlands which have a lot of ecological value. There was major concern about that. I went back 5 years later to the same spot. It was a bit devastating to have a look at what had happened, which is the next slide, number 7, and it was slightly encouraging because the thing we noticed is that although the flood had scoured out huge depths of 2 metres or more of the bank, that there was actually a lot of regeneration of native species, sedges and paperbarks, and I was expecting that it might be totally weed infested, but it wasn't, and so that was a bit encouraging. The rivers themselves tend to recover in some way. Back into the Fitzgerald River again, just an example of the spongylite over the granite, quite spectacular country. And it explains why the South Coast Highway is further inland and somewhat subdued. So when you're passing over the rivers, they don't want to put roads, too expensive to put roads across these spectacular areas. So most people have little knowledge that 10 kilometres south of the highway are quite spectacular gorges.
Again, this is where the river comes down off onto the Ravensthorpe ramp and cuts down through the landscape quite steeply.
Yeah, and number 9, Pallinup site. Back in 2000, I had an opportunity through involvement with a local catchment group management group to survey 50 kilometres of the Pallinup River in the middle reaches, and it occurred to me while doing that walk to assess the condition, to do a whole series of photographs, specific site photographs, with using a GPS to reference them, because of the difficulty to determine how things are changing. And I thought one day it might be quite valuable to go back to these sites and do that, and that opportunity occurred in this year, 2017, when we were able to revisit 155 sites, which is quite substantial over a 43 kilometre reach, and start to make assessments about the resilience of the river, the condition of the riparian zone, and what the issues were, and particularly how has it changed in 16 years. And in February of this year, there was a huge flood, very big flood, comparable to the big floods of 1955 and 1982. And so it also provided an opportunity to determine how resilient is the floodway to these big floods that may indeed become more frequent over the coming years. So this is the 2000 image, and the next image, number 10, is the same site in September 2017, and we were able to analyse these comparisons and say, well, what was similar and what had changed, even down to looking at individual logs or bank erosion scours, and we tried to approach this in an analytical sense to make a statement about the degree of change that had taken place in the river.
So from this image, you can see that the log is still across the river. The tree that was roots were being exposed is still present, and this is after quite a major flood, and not quite as devastating as perhaps you would originally think. Nonetheless, there was quite a bit of devastation further down.
But overall, the floodway has retained its essential character. Further inland, yes, that's slide 11, is a farm a bit further out from the Albany hinterland up towards Franklin River, so this is about 110 kilometres inland, well up on the Yilgarn. It shows you the undulating nature of the landscape, the subdued waterways. There's a drainage line in the foreground, wide and shallow, and those are typical of the Yilgarn Plateau, which you encounter as you head inland from Albany. And it has similarities across most of the south coast, superficially. Here we have a little wetland up near the Stirling Ranges, and that's slide 12. Illustrating what's called secondary salinisation and also the issue of waterlogging. This little wetland would probably have dried out most summers. In the past, it was well wooded with yates and eucalypts, but with rising groundwater, bringing salt to the surface and keeping the lake inundated for longer period of times, the vegetation's died off. And that's a fairly common sight along the edge of the Yilgarn, a bit further inland from the coast, where you have a lot of these salt lakes, small and large.
That's part of what's called secondary salinisation. So a lot of these areas have a measure of salinity to start with, but with the rising groundwater, salty groundwater, the landscape's becoming more saline.
Further over towards Bremer Bay, we've got slide 13, a wetland where the riparian vegetation has been left in place, and it's quite generous buffer. The landowners have obviously valued this particular wetland, which is quite shallow. Most of them are shallow, and sometimes in some years they may even dry out completely, but quite salty, but fairly healthy vegetation around the edge. This is the sort of thing we prefer to see with more wetlands up on the plateau.
These wetlands, despite being saline, have quite a natural aquatic value. There's many endemic species, mostly in the crustaceans, that are locally endemic. In other words, they're only found in a local range of wetlands and nowhere else. So they do have quite a value.
Okay, slide 14. Matty's Lake, it's up near Ongerup. Some of these wetland illustrates a wetland that still holds fresh water. It hasn't become highly saline, although there's quite a lot of trees dying. That may be an inundation waterlogging issue, but it still retains paper barks and things in good condition, and that water there is actually quite fresh. It's not salty. So there were probably many of these wetlands across the south coast, but they are fairly superficial fresh water overlying a essentially saline landscape.
And of course, freshwater has a huge diversity of aquatic invertebrates that live within it, whereas your saline landscapes don't have the diversity, but they do have the high endemicity.
This lake, not very far, in fact only a kilometre or two from the previous one, has an advanced stage of secondary salinisation. You can see that it was once wooded. Now we're getting samphires, which are more salt tolerant, lower diversity of trees and plants, and this was, if I recall rightly, not quite as salty as the sea, but it was quite very, very saline. So it's degrading due to waterlogging and saline increased salinity.
That's showing me looking at collecting some aquatic invertebrate samples from the water.
Slide 16. A few kilometres away again, not very far, a pink lake, and highly saline. In fact, so saline that I couldn't even use the meter to determine it. It would be, in my estimate, brine, very shallow. The interesting thing here is there are no dead trees, and we suspected here that being a bit lower in the landscape, that this lake, along with others, has been naturally very saline even before the land was cleared, and so it's not It may have become more saline, but it certainly was a different environment than the previous two slides. Most of our rivers on the south coast end in an estuary or an inlet, which is a wide, shallow body of water, and its interface with the sea is governed by a sandbar. The ocean waves and currents build up the sand to actually dam the inlet, so the waters in the inlet can be dammed in there for many years, and it takes a fairly large flow of water into the inlet to break the bar and discharge water out into the ocean. And then once that initial rush has faded away, there's opportunity for high tides to send fresh seawater, I should say, seawater back up into the inlet and change the quality of the water in the main basin. This is Stokes Inlet, which is at the bottom of two moderately large catchments called Young River and the Lort River, about 70 kilometres west of Esperance. Slide 18 is also Stokes Inlet, and it just shows something of the typical vegetation that you get around the edge of our inlets, including those close to Albany, where you get largely paperbarks and sedges, quite picturesque, shallow waters, and the water levels rising and falling, and the paperbarks are able to exist in that. If the water level stays down for a long time, we find often a lot of regeneration of young paperbarks out from the shore. If the water level stays up, they tend to die off again.
The paperbarks require fresh water to germinate, so as the water level in the estuary goes down, fresh rainwater sits on the top and forms the basis for germination. And once the water levels come up, they can tolerate a certain amount of saline water inundation, but if they're waterlogged for too long a period of time, they don't like it and will die.
So I would say that paperbarks and their a common characteristic of our coastal estuaries and inlets, even as far as Walpole and further. Okay. Slide 19 is just close up of on Stokes Inlet again. Here the water has receded, and you get these dense groves of paperbarks, which are quite picturesque.
Medieval, or
what would we say? Mysterious-looking forests. Okay, 20. Occasionally inlets break, big flood. This is Cullen Inlet, which is near Hopeton, went out in, was it this year? February 2017, took out the causeway. The interesting thing is that for 150 years or so, the inlet bar was only known to have broken twice. But in the last 20 years, it's opened several times. And the question is that a result of climate shift, and will we see more of those openings? It's a ground level view of the causeway, where the causeway was that went out. That was also went out in 2000 and had to be rebuilt. And 17 years later, the same things happened again.
This is 22. Around the lakes and the inlets, there are remnants of some of the aquatic life. What you've got there is the small coiled, in particular, the small pinkish shells. They're a coxiella and very difficult to identify without doing genetic analysis, but there are quite a few different species that are fairly locally endemic, and a very common feature of our saline wetlands.
As well as the inlets, yeah. Slide 23, the Young River, shows the mouth of the Young River as it flows into Stokes Inlet, and it's a fairly common situation. The broad basin of the inlets are shallow, and the upper reaches that are influenced by the water levels in the estuary tend to be more river-like, so they're a type of transitional area that have some of the characteristics of the open inlet, but some of the characteristics of the river feeding into it upstream. Kelvin River entering Oyster Harbour has a similar type of form.